Welcome to the How Humans Work podcast. I am your host, Jef Szi. My guest today is someone very near and dear to me, Alice Treves. I wanted to drop this episode just to keep the energy going. As always, appreciate you tuning in. Hit me up if you have any questions. Without further ado, Alice Treves and Jef Szi in a rambling, musing conversation about the human ego. Here we go. Alice Treves, welcome to the How Humans Work podcast. I'm really glad to have you here with me today.
Thank you, Jeffrey Salaji. I'm really happy to be here.
For those who don't know, Alice and I are married. And one of the beautiful things about marriage is you can be desperate in marriage. And I'm slightly desperate, and I know that you can help me with that. And I'm desperate in this way. It's part of the journey of working with the podcast and really finding a rhythm, and then dropping out of my rhythm and just being, I don't know what to do next. Mm-hmm. And so thanks for coming on the show, because I am desperate. I actually honestly am at a loss exactly where to go. Mm-hmm. But I think about the things for me that I find valuable, that I like to talk about, and I do want to create shows and have discussions about. And one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about is kind of a bonus episode. Like, let's just keep the energy going, keep finding those conversations that matter. And one of the conversations that really matters to me is our conversation around ego. Mm-hmm. So I've invited you on today to share our conversation we've had around the ego over the past, I think more specifically 3 or 4 years, but in general, probably, because we've been together 24 years now, that we have an understanding about each other's ego structures and development that's really, really helpful. But I think it's also important just to let people know who you are a little bit. And so beyond being my wife, you are a professional in the world. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So professionally, I'm a psychotherapist. I have a private practice in Marin. And I also work at a independent high school as a therapist and a part-time teacher there of social emotional learning and psychology.
You're awesome. And I know you've done a lot of good work with young people and also in your private practice. Though I have to say, I do know less about that because you're really good at confidentiality. But I trust that, and I trust you, and I trust our relationship. So let's get into this conversation around ego. And I'm going to put the question to you first. What did I start saying to you that suddenly made you rethink the ego and its value and its function?
The thing that you started bringing to me in your thoughtfulness about evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology was the idea that how did you say it? We're rising apes?
Yeah.
Is that how you said it?
Yeah, and for the listeners, what I would say is a number of years ago when I really started looking deeper into stress, and I started looking deeper beyond my Chinese medicine initial training, and I realized that I was less a fallen angel and more of an upright primate, an upright ape. Yeah,
upright ape. I like that. Yeah, so I was coming out of a spiritual community at the time when you were kind of forming these thoughts, and I had felt intuitively like there was some transcendental orientation in that community.
And what do you mean by transcendental?
Transcendental is like rising above the ego. We've got to supersede the ego. We've got to rise above it. And that has been throughout my spiritual training that I've done since I was pretty young. I started meditating when I was 13 with a Buddhist community and followed Buddhism, different strains of Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh and a lot of Vipassana. And to come to my own understanding of how important, through my work, my psychological work and my personal work, how important the body is, how we cannot disentangle the ego and the body, where we are embodied. And then for you to bring that idea to me was very kind of crystallizing in my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with the the conflict that's in there in spiritual communities and certain psychological approaches and a lot with health, because I saw the same conflict with self. And so I would say the upright primate thing, and I think other people have come to that conclusion in their own way. I've heard it said in a number of ways, but was really for me what I call an evolutionary awakening. That the awakening to the fact that the way I feel, think, experience my life is an echo forward of ancestral energies and patterns. Yeah, there's definitely the personal, my family unit, my own development, my community, my society, but most deeply, the strongest part of me as a human is the echo of humanity happening through me. And so much of those things that were set and developed happened in more ancient species than humans or even early primates, all the way back to the cellular world. But when I started to realize that there was a sense in my body that was connected farther back, I started rethinking how I thought and felt about myself, my own desires, my own tendencies, my own confusions. I started to re-look at my own spiritual orientation with a deep evolutionary bent. And it really transformed how I was thinking about it. And so the place where that started culminating for me was when we were backpacking in Desolation Wilderness, and our children were young and they needed help going to the bathroom in the wilderness. And I would also work down in the city, in the financial district. And there's homeless people who don't have the resources they need. So I was just contrasting, defecation in the city, defecation in the wilderness. And the defecation in the wilderness, just like, it felt okay. There was nothing gross about it, just kind of belonged there. And then defecation in the city, it's like, gross. So I started thinking about the ego that way, that the biggest problem with, and for me, ego that I've looked at is it's Latin for I, and a sense of self. A sense of self-value, a sense of self-esteem, a sense of self-awareness, that those are things that we actually need. A sense of defense, a sense of being able to protect ourselves, having fears, all those deep neurological things, right? So I started to realize, so much of why the ego smells bad is really just the modern context. And so we've lost the modern story, the mismatched story with the ego, instead of seeing its true value in the wilderness when it's well placed in relationship. So that was my kind of early thread in the early part of last decade of like moving towards a deeper embrace of the nature of having a sense of self.
And what's your sense now of what a well-placed ego
I think it's
is?
tricky. I don't think, in a hunter-gatherer society that those ego structures are really clear. A healthy hunter-gatherer society, they would be well-placed and worked with and related with. But I think in modern times, we have this beautiful thing where we can exaggerate certain parts of ourselves. People can become massively tooled and eccentric in some way, like Salvador Dali. It could just be this amazing creative person, or some other kind of massively influential and inspiring person, but that doesn't mean that they have a well-balanced ego. So I kind of think we're stuck in some ways with the time, and that we can understand the need for a self. And I would think one of the places we could talk about around the ego and the need for a sense of self comes with the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, and how we both got really turned on to her work, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain.
Yeah.
And that really...
That's right. The predictive element of the ego.
That's right. That the brain's function is to predict. And simultaneously, the brain is more efficiently hallucinating or using stored information rather than doing the energy resource of direct, fresh perception. It's like we just call on the familiar all the time.
Yeah. So before we started our conversation, I was just kind of sitting with, what's my experience of my ego? And for me, it's mind. It's the chatter and the well-worn grooves that I am so familiar with, that I go back to, that's an orientation. And that's my experience of ego. I don't know if that's the kind of engine that ego uses. but it's definitely mind. So that fits with Lisa Feldman Barrett's sense of it's there to make sense of and predict and feel safe in relationship to our environment.
Yeah, I agree. And I always think, because when you talk about safe, I think about stress, and it's hard to disentangle stress and ego, right? At least ego, as we talk about it as the defensive structure and our kind of worst selfish behaviors when we have a very poor or inadequate model of what's going on around us. Right. So, so when you talk about that safety and you talk about that mind, I'm interested more in hearing more what you have to say about that, in terms of the well-worn grooves, because the well-worn grooves are obviously familiar. They've been worked at, repetitions, half conscious, unconscious, right? And how you feel about your mind, and like what's your relationship with your mind as you experience it right now, or your ego as you're experiencing it.
Yeah. One thing I've been thinking about, using my mind to think about, is as you grow older, I've just been noticing, not necessarily with me, but with people around me, and I think with me as well, that anything that is habitual in terms of our thinking patterns becomes more ingrained as we get older. And, so people get more stuck in their ways. And I think it's neurological. It's literally the wiring of thought patterns in our brain. And the way that I experience that is, like I said, through my mind chatter. And the thing that has come to me in terms of the tool to work with it, there's a couple of things. It's really noticing, using the mindfulness ability to kind of say, okay, there I am in that pattern again. And I have ways of identifying different general streams, especially when it comes to negative thought patterns. And the other thing is parts work. Yeah.
I want to talk about both of those. I think those are great. And then a minute ago, when you said that as we age, and I was like, there can be a loss of range of motion. And so just like we need flexibility in our bodies, we need neurological flexibility.
Absolutely.
Right?
100%.
So I think the fair critique of the ego or the sense of self is when it's fixated, right? Or when it's losing range of motion in terms of its flexibility, of its sense of what could be, or what the position is, right?
Yeah.
I think the other fair critique is the issues that come around with a separated self, a small self, right? But I think the challenge of being in that critique of the small self is it can begin to, it's like, for me, I'll just tell this story because I had to do it a long time ago, was when the voice, I call it the super ego, is the ego that's actually more righteous, more spiritual, knows more, and is criticizing me. And one time I just got the gumption to turn around and look at it and see if I could see the face of the voice that was criticizing me. And I saw a very unhappy, lonely, scared human being there. Not my own face, but a part.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Back at the parts work. And that was really helpful for me because I started to realize, okay, the super ego that's judging the ego can be even more tyrannical, more problematic. Dominating the small self is not exactly a healthy way for the mind to be interacting. And I think in the gap of the wilderness and the hunter-gatherer thing, I think the modern experience is much of this mind as chatter, mind as not adequate, mind as scared, confused, but can't really do it. So let's create a facade of comfort or acceptability.
Absolutely.
So maybe we are going towards parts work on that.
Yeah. Let's see. What's the entry point with parts work?
Why don't you tell people what parts work is for those who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, parts work is, and this is the deep study of many well-versed therapists, including Dick Schwartz and John Eisman, to name a couple of my teachers. And they talk about, each of them in a little bit different ways, but the fragmented selves that we all get stuck in. That's that kind of, loss of range of flexibility. It's the part we often get reflected back to us from our partners or, people who are close to us or our coworkers that isn't functioning that well. But there's all kinds of parts. There's all kinds of parts of us that we adopt at different points in our lives. And the critical aspect of it is that when we're hurt as children, we adapt by creating some kind of self that comes in to protect us and to adjust to our circumstances. And it's usually got a great intention, and it's usually above its pay grade. Yeah. Because it comes in at a time when we're young and we don't really have the capacity to care for ourselves, but we pretend that we do. And so we develop these selves, these kind of fragmented selves that come in to try and adjust to the world and be a somewhat of a veil or a screen or a sentry, a guard, to try and deal with, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that life is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. And so that fundamental defense, I guess the question I was thinking, is that a false self? People talk about false self, authentic self. In your view, is that defensive part that comes in to shield an underdeveloped or a hurting?
I guess I see it as an aspect of self. It's just kind of fragmented from the true self. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing that, both of them talk about is that there is a unified self. There really is a sense of self. We come in whole, and these little fragments are just it's like a fragmented mirror or something, it just distorts what the essence is and what our truth is a little bit, but it's still connected to that source.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about pain aversion a little bit and as a kind of motivation for us to fragment, because it's easier to, if we're overwhelmed as a young person, to face certain kinds of hurts and certain kinds of pain. In fact, I had an interaction with someone recently in my practice who's in their 60s and they're still not quite able to meet their abandonment issues. Like, it's too intense even to still feel exactly the depth of the abandonment, So I definitely see that protective part, and I appreciate that. And so for me, from a neuroscience, but also more importantly, an evolutionary point of view, I'm like, okay, that seems, it can be problematic, but that defensive structure seems necessary.
Absolutely.
And starting to appreciate it in its limits, but ego development, right? Self-development, self-identity development, self-worth development. Not to, become inflated in as a kind of false, I'm separate from the rest of the universe. Funny joke, very funny. Like, that's just really funny right now. I'm not sure why. Uh-huh. And then, so that I'm separate from the universe, and then I'm going to put up this like big human skill thing, or, have a massive profile, or, a kind of a deep front of status and of power. I'm not talking about that kind of ego development, but, I do think that part of ego development is dealing with power, right? And loss of power, and how to have enough, going to Lisa Feldman Barrett, how to have a holodeck at which our internal reality is lining up with external reality in a healthy, functional way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. One thing that I want to riff off from that is the sense of compassion that we have for our fragmented defense structures, how they show up, is really what's going to help us transform them and also have that neurological shift and that flexibility. Mm-hmm. We're never going to rid ourselves of, these allies that show up in our lives, but we can not have them in the driver's seat. And we can do that through compassionately understanding why they showed up and the job that they're trying to do.
Yeah, that's true. It's beautiful as well. And I'm kind of curious, just to bring the listeners in a little bit more deeper into your own knowledge there. How do you build compassion for a defensive part that, say, maybe is over its pay grade, right? You're like, it comes in and you kind of like, oh, I got this, I can do this. And really deep down, there's not a genuine ego development. There's not a genuine sense of self that's competent.
Right. Well, my sense of compassion comes from listening. If you not only listen, but you hear, either where someone else is coming from or one of your parts is coming from, then the transformation happens on its own. You kind of open yourself to like, okay. And then you might have feelings about the part, and you kind of have to deal with that as well before you can really dialogue with it in a way where you want to understand where it's coming from. Like get it in a heart level, not just in a head level.
Yeah.
And then it's about really healing what it's trying to protect. So whatever got frozen at that time also needs to be felt. Needs to be actually witnessed and felt. And so with its permission, you go and you do that work. And I find it profound in terms of its healing capacity, and also, like the neurological flexibility that can happen around that too, of understanding like, oh, I have parts and I'm coming from that right now, but I have choice around that.
Yeah, keep going. I like what you're saying. If you got more. Yeah.
No, I think that's good for now.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. I'm just listening and I'm taking it in, and I'm just thinking about the different things we've been riffing off, and we've been going, we're 20 some minutes in, and we've been cruising here on lots of things: evolution, parts work, ego development, ego structure. And I'm just kind of figuring out what the next move is for me. Yeah. I think partly what's coming, I want to come back to, is a little bit the spiritual transcendental part.
Sure.
I've named what I consider my own super ego kind of self-criticism. And I know that I started calling it the small soul, the ego, as a way to be benevolent towards it. And I see the small soul as a kind of necessary function that is somewhat limited, can be really cool and really amazing, is super fascinating, is tied to deeper self-healing mechanisms like that are in there, like when you talk about just listening and like it just starts to work out, like just being present to the truth of the neurological experience or the imaginative life story structure that we're all generating, and how it can start to self-correct once you give it that presence. So I think that's that healing spirit that's kind of intrinsic, that homeostasis is there. But I've been working on what I would consider kind of a defense of the ego. And my defense of the ego is it's a small soul and it's necessary. It's imperfect, particularly as complicated as the world is, as overwhelming it is. One of the things I do to build compassion, and I think the hunter-gatherer story is helpful because I realize when I tell it is that, wow, maybe in your lifetime you met 1,000 people. You knew 40, maybe 70 people who knew you really well. Doesn't mean you all liked each other. It was all great, but there was coherency there, and the amount of novelty and uncertainty which was coming in informationally, globally, at all the levels that we have. And then you think, well, basically, you develop some mastery with your environment. Like, you can hunt, you can gather. Yeah, there's adversities. Yeah, there's other human tribes that you're competing with, but the amount of threat in the environment is very clear, and you've developed and equipped to handle it, or you didn't make it. Right. And
also, as you're talking, I'm thinking about dopamine in relationship to ego, because that would be a really interesting little sidetrack.
Let's go there. Yeah. What are you thinking?
Well, novelty. I mean, so threat in terms of like everything was relatively predictable, right? But novelty affected our brain in a way where things were very heightened. Whether it was a novel food that we came upon, like some honey, in a tree, or a novel experience of a new tribe, or the novel experience of an animal that you'd never, maybe that wouldn't happen, that there would be an animal that you hadn't encountered before, right? Within your little biosphere. But novelty, we didn't have a lot of it, and we have so much of it now. And how does that relate to the ego in your mind?
That's a great question. I think that part of our ego structure or our cultural practices around our life is we can easily use novelty as a way to stimulate a sense of movement. And the reason I say that is I notice in my relationship when I drink coffee, which is a dopamine promoter, it's almost as if I'm moving. It's almost as if something is actually happening. But really, I'm just drinking a cup of liquid, and I'm not really doing a lot in my space. So, I think that we are moved synthetically and culturally and socially by all the access to novelty and new things and new ideas and new stories and that's very stimulating. And I think we have highly stimulated egos, and that's where I was talking before about the exaggerations. Like we get these really, and it's kind of cool. Like you wouldn't see a hunter-gatherer maybe there would be eccentricity in some way, but not like we have in today's world. Mm-hmm. And so it's distorted, but I don't mean it negative. It's just exaggerated. We just have I think we have exaggerated, stimulated egos. But I think the problem with that on the dopamine, and going back to episode 19 with Anna Lemke, is that stimulation, that hyperstimulation, creates neurological imbalances which cause us to have a distorted sense of self. I mean, we can go right to the research right now around young girls and their sense of self and how they're feeling about it in relationship to social media and the emotions it generates. Right. So interesting, stimulation generates pain, which would be right there in her line of work with Dopamine Nation. What do you think? Does that seem right, or you got a different idea?
No, I mean, I that's a deep one. That's one to touch on, the effect of social media and the distortion and the hyped upness of, the dopamine and the novelty.
All the filters that are going around right now, like all the feeds are all about catfishing filters and fake filters and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that I have right now a lot to say about that. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen the filters. I'm a little detached from social media right now.
Good on you.
Yeah. But there's a lot of dopamine available for me when I'm ready to go back. I had a little dive into TikTok the other day because I'm off work for the Christmas break, and it was like crack. Like I could just stay on here for hours.
And you feel like something's actually happening, right? Yeah. And it's all a simulation, and it's all like, and what's your sense of self after that? Like if I think about all the time I've spent, very few of the little videos or posts I've seen actually stick with me.
Yeah.
They actually stick with me.
It's so
they
true.
They actually matter. Yeah. And they don't.
Yeah.
Most of them don't. Occasionally they inspire, and occasionally they're funny, and it's a good way as to kind of pass some time occasionally. Yeah. All right. So before we went down the dopamine ego and the stimulation road, what was I talking about?
You were talking about ego. What were you talking
a defense of the ego. Wasn't I talking about my defense of the ego? Yeah. And I was talking about the small soul.
Uh-huh.
So I guess what I've tried to come, and this is partly in relationship to the internal family systems work that you mentioned, Schwartz and Eisman, you said? Mm-hmm. And what you are referring as parts work is that ego development is really important. Mm-hmm. And so when people are busy trying to self-deny ego experiences that are deeply tied to evolutionary motivations, that's problematic. Mm-hmm. I think it's better to develop a sense of self that can account for, obviously, at some level or at every level, we're more connected to the universe and to the play of nature and life than we imagine ourselves to be. That's a problem. But more importantly, that there is I just lost that off to come back. Let's see. Let's go to your thing, and then maybe it'll re-stimulate mine.
The thing that was coming up for me, just to kind of continue a little bit on the simulation of movement, is just how important actual movement is.
Exactly.
Like actual analog, full-on
friction.
True friction and movement in the world, whether that's through exercise or sex or what are some other good movement?
I don't think anything else is important beyond those two. No, you've got the full list. Yeah. No, I think creative movement could definitely fall in there, like, an inspiration like today. This is a creative movement. We're actually moving something, energy and neurologically. But you're right to come back to movement because that's dopamine's like basic function. And we know from people who are dealing with Parkinson's that when you have dopamine issues, you have movement issues.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's good to name those.
Yeah. Yeah, but I still want to hear your defense of the ego.
So my defense is that the ego is essential. It's partial, but it needs development. And if we're busy trying to knock it down we're hurting our soul a little bit. I find it's much more benevolent, connected, to realize that the deep motivations in me, I think I recovered, is around the values that I am evolved to have in my life. That the concerns that I have, that I would call stress, where my ego concerns and self-defense would come up, are implicitly there because of the thread of humanity. Okay, somewhat exaggerated, distorted with modern culture or whatever, but they're still at work. You know, all the research says these things are still working out through us, and we're not going to like quickly bypass them. We're not going to quickly suddenly jump around these things. We're going to be carrying them. And so I think that we are in a time of humanity where, a lot of social activism, I wish humans wouldn't, I wish we wouldn't, I wish we couldn't, and there's a lot of things I agree with, but I think we're not going to get there just by wishing, but by really teaching us all to develop. And I think this is why parts work is actually so transformative potentially for society, is when we start to come into these different neurological evolutionary parts and give them an actual place.
Totally.
Like if I don't have value in myself, if there's no place for value, of course I'm going to be depressed, right? And that's a real genuine human need.
Yeah.
And that control, which is the other word that comes with the ego, if you want to cause stress at a level that causes disease in an organism, put them in a place where they have no control. Take a primate, separate them from other primates, no food resources, lots of predators, they're going to be highly stressed out. Why? Because you need a modicum of control. And this gets back to, we could go back to the stimulation, where it's the illusion where we think we have control through our phones or something, but do we genuinely have control over the trajectory right now? I think that's a really good question, and I think it's questionable. What do you think?
I love all of those thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, the ego is partly the semblance, like you said, of control. And I really like the idea, not only in parts work, but to also take it back to evolutionary biology. That what I get from evolutionary biology is that it makes sense so much of how we behave. It makes sense so much of our patterns, of relating to each other, and how we do need each other in community, and so much of the status stuff and the sexuality stuff. I mean, it's just there's just some wiring there that we're not ultimately limited by, and we are in this moment in humanity where it's like we are a rising ape. So
I say upright primate,
because
I think that ape has some, social significance in terms of social history and social suppression.
Right.
That I think primate's a cleaner word. So I go rising primate's good. I go upright primate. Yeah,
okay, cool. I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that we are, that we can understand what our heritage is evolutionarily, in our neurology, in our brain, in our bodies, in our behavior. And that we can know that that's where we come from and have compassion for it, back to the parts work, and make choices around that, kind of evolve from that and with that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's good. And there's a couple things that come along with it for me. And I really love what you're saying, but a couple things come along with is the inequities. I feel a tremendous amount of compassion for the kind of inequities for people who are not giving the parts that they need in order not to feel massively stressed as a human in this world. I'd like to see more equity around that. Like it's interesting to tie the deep inborn issues of evolutionary biology with social justice and be like, this is actually speaking to the dignity of humanity, of each person,
totally.
and recognizing that.
Yeah. I was listening to Krista Tippett interviewing Jane Hirschfield on her podcast a couple days ago. And they were both talking about how, and this is a very nascent idea for me, but it fits with what you're saying about how, as human beings, we do need to evolve out of an economic system that has so many people stressed out all the time. That really makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And in terms of toxic stress in particular. I mean, I'm pro stress too. I'm pro a little bit of control. I'm pro a little bit of ego, and I'm pro stress, right? Which is funny.
Well, it's what we've got to deal with. I mean,
Yeah,
we're here
totally,
with it.
Totally. So, there's also something really beautiful around, in Chinese medicine, they call it the three treasures, the Jing, Qi, and Shen. And so like they understood the essence of humanity in a way, and they saw it as connected to the essences of the earth and the essences of the sky and the heavens. And there was a deep wisdom that was there. And so it's nice to appreciate it, like, and kind of like tie what we might frame as egoic problems as a part that's trying to work itself out, that has function and value. And our job is to solve that riddle and that puzzle for ourselves and more people.
Nice.
And give them a place.
I really like that. That's a good invitation. That's a good starting, not only almost a new year, but for you, a new decade. I just want to acknowledge that you turned 50 today.
Yeah.
You're turning 50. You're in the process of turning.
Thank you. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, no, it's good to do this. I kind of like this is like a birthday present in a way, to have this conversation.
Really sweet.
Thank you so much for joining us today. All music is performed by the incredible and effervescent Chase Jackson at chasejacksonmusic.com. Please support this podcast by following us on your favorite streaming platform, sharing it with your community and friends, and by making a modest donation to our Patreon page. To learn more about this show, our guest, as well as Jeffrey and his work helping people make peace with their human nature, go to howhumanswork.us.